basically does the job for the officer, and that is a huge plus, because when they come to write up their report, they'll have to look at all the objections, and instead of them deciding whether or not your scheme is acceptable, you'll have a very handy note that they can just refer to. So submitting a letter against the objections can be a really, really effective step. What I want to talk about first is doing the right research before you even think about submitting or approaching the council with an application. So much time is wasted and lost, and frustration gains by just people not doing the right research. I mean, you see proposals come in that just have no hope in hell of planning permission ever being granted, and all it took was for someone to just do a basic research of the planning policies and a basic research of the planning history. So often some people would submit an application for the exact same thing that's been refused for a couple of years ago, and they think things have changed, or for some reason their proposal would be better or would work now. That's just not the case. It's very unlikely unless there's been a significant change in either policy or the circumstances around the site. The other thing is policy. When planning officers get an application and they can see within the first seconds of looking at the drawings that they're going to be refused, or if they're going to be approved, generally speaking, when it goes to like the householder stuff, because you just immediately know when someone is going too far. You know, all you need to do is just check either the prevailing development around your site or checking the planning policies. Guidance, quite often councils have guidance that they have, say, they'll have SPDs that they explain that certain designs will be acceptable within that borough or that local council, and that's your ticket through to just submitting a stress-free application, doing your right research. So often so much time is wasted, so before you even think about going anywhere near the council, just do your research. Is what I'm proposing too big? Is it does it not have enough parking? Does it not have enough employment floor space? Is it the wrong materials? Is, you know, all these things. Is there no sustainability criteria with it? Do those things, because don't forget how much time you're wasting with this. It's not only the officer's time, but it's also your time. I mean, if you submit an application, you're going to wait at least 8 weeks to get a decision, at least. It's very unlikely you're going to get a decision before then. And by that time, if you get a refusal because you haven't done your research, you've wasted not only 2 months, but then you've also wasted the time it takes to reassess the application and maybe go again. And you'll also waste your time at appeal, thinking, because people haven't done their research, they'll have no idea that if they went to appeal, they'll also get refused, because there's clear policies and there's a clear planning history pointing them to something that's not acceptable. So, and if you're going to appeal, we're talking months. So you could be losing 3, 4, 5 months out of a year on a scheme that if you only just spent a couple of hours researching before, you would have been golden. And if you want the inside track on how to get planning approval for any type of development that you want to do, click the link below to download your free guide to get the 6 steps it takes to get planning permission for anything you want to do. And the second step is to get the right drawings. Approach someone that knows that they're doing the right drawings for planning. Quite often, people that are doing particularly home extensions, say for a conservatory, or if they're getting roof lights, or if they're getting any type of extension or alteration to their house, the contractor that provides, say, that conservatory says, oh, in their package, oh, we'll do the planning, we'll do it for you. Quite often the stuff that those guys submit is really below par and doesn't work. So every council has a local validation checklist, which I'll talk about, that tells you what drawings you need to submit. But at the basic level, you need a site location plan, you need a site plan, you need floor plans, you need elevations, and you need sections, and they need to be clearly understood. They need to be titled correctly, and they need to have the right drawing numbers, because as I'll get to in a minute, getting through validation is a real process. So making sure you get through that comes down largely, particularly if you're doing home extensions, to doing correct drawings. So if you get a quote from someone and they say, oh yeah, we submit drawings all the time, ask them, where did you submit applications, what authority, what was the address, because then you can just check. And generally speaking, if you go to the application and you understand the drawings, or you like them, then it's going to be very likely that the officer does too, and the council's going to accept them and what they're saying is true. So the next step is getting through validation, and this is such an important part for people that aren't so familiar with the planning system to get through. People might get really frustrated with it and just thinking, oh, it's pencil pushers at the council preventing me from doing what I want to do. That may be true, but there is a process that you need to go through. Every council, as I've said, has a local validation checklist. Go to type in the council's website, find the checklist, and depending on what your scheme is, whether it's a home extension, whether it's a new house, whether it's change of use or a new commercial building, they will have a list of criteria, a list of documents that you will need to submit with that. So make sure you check that, because so many people just think they know better, don't submit it. And if you can't get through validation, honestly, it adds so much time to your application, because most councils have two teams. They have an officer who determines your application, the guy that you speak to get a decision, and they also have a validations team. Some councils are trying to merge the two, but the validations team, you have to get through that process. So if you think that validations teams of maybe 3, 4, 5 people, hundreds of applications are coming in per week, probably more than that per week. And if they have to, first of all, they're checking your scheme and they're checking it against that validation checklist. And if you're missing anything, they'll just send you an email asking for it, and they'll move on to the next thing. And they won't have time, even if you submit, even if you reply to them straight away, they won't have time to get back to you in the same day, probably not the same week. It may take longer. So getting that validation is really, really important, because once you get your validation date, that's when the clock starts ticking for your application, your 8-week deadline, or your 8-week deadline, or your 13-week deadline, depending on if you're a normal application or a major. Validation is really important. Go to the validations checklist, check what you need, and this is where what I said before about getting good drawings comes in, because most people who want to do home extensions and alterations to a house, just getting good drawings is the key to validations. Make sure they're the right scale. Make sure they show roads that they're being asked for. Make sure they show the development in context if it's needed. Showing the other properties next door, that kind of thing. If you're impacting a tree, make sure you have a tree report. If you're proposing parking, make sure you probably need some sort of transport note. Again, it depends on the scale of your development. Just check it against the criteria you need, submit it, and you're golden. Because if you get through validation, it's so much easier after it. Once you've got through that step of validation, then the application gets put on the council's records, it becomes a public record, and then the consultation process starts. And then that is a 21-day process. Legally it has to be 21 days, but anyone can submit an objection or a letter of support, very unlikely, within the whole time frame of the application, and it can be considered at any time. So it's not like 21 days happens and it's over. It just means that the council can make a decision after those 21 days. So this is where it comes, this is when speaking to your community or having really clear information with your application really, really helps. Because if you've spoken to your community, like your neighbours or local community groups before, then if they expect it, then they're going to be less angry, basically. You want to just dampen all kind of anger in the area, because just planning has a way of doing that. It just incites anger for people for some reason. And the other thing is having clear drawings. If your drawings are crystal clear, it's easy for the community to understand what's going to happen, how it's going to impact them, but it also allows the officer to understand what the impacts are, because then they can see for themselves whether or not the neighbour's objections are valid. So pro tip is what you can do. As objections keep coming in, the officer will upload them, or the validations team will upload them onto the council's portal. Go onto that record, see what objections have come in, and then send a letter to the officer explaining how your proposal kind of mitigates against those objections. This can be really, really effective, because it basically does the job for the officer, and that is a huge plus, because when they come to write up their report, they'll have to look at all the objections, and instead of them deciding whether or not your scheme is acceptable, you'll have a very handy note that they can just refer to. So submitting a letter against the objections can be a really, really effective step. So the application process takes between 8 and 13 weeks, and in that time you want to gradually increase the amount that you try to contact your officer. I know this is kind of the holy grail for people, because getting hold of an officer, it can be really, really hard. So my recommendation is let the consultation process start probably about 2 to 3 weeks in. Send your officer an email once a week, and then as you get closer to the determination deadline, and if you haven't heard from them obviously, start increasing the level of emails and the calls that you do, probably up to 2 and maybe even 3 times a week, obviously, once you get closer. And if you still haven't heard from them when it comes to near the determination date, I'd start emailing them straight away, every day. and then you might want to step it up. Maybe you want to get their manager, because all of a sudden things start happening when people's managers get contacted, because then they start getting pressure from above their management. So assuming you've now got planning permission, the really important step is to check your decision, because even though it's come from the council, you need to make sure that the drawing numbers are correct, you need to make sure that all the documents listed are the right versions, and you need to make sure that the conditions are acceptable and correct, because the conditions will sometimes normally it's like condition 3 will list the drawing numbers. Just make sure they're all right, and also if there's any conditions on there that you don't agree with, or that you already agreed with the officer that they wouldn't be included, then get back to them immediately saying this is not right, this is why, please have this decision reissued. You can do that. Checking the drawing numbers, documents, and making sure the conditions are right. Checking the decision date as well, really, really important. So just check your decision notice. So when it comes to appealing, you've got a couple of options. You can appeal against non-determination. So that's something a lot of people don't know about. If you don't hear from your council within 8 weeks, if you haven't got a decision from your council within 8 weeks of the validation date, then you have a right of appeal against non-determination, either against the 8 weeks or against the date that you've already agreed with the council. So if you haven't, that's after the 8 weeks. So if you haven't got a decision by that time, you have a right of appeal of non-determination. The other is this kind of standard appeal, which you can appeal up to 6 months after you get your decision, and you can appeal either the planning refusal against the whole scheme, or you can appeal against an actual approval. If there's a condition on there that you don't think is correct, or you don't think is right, it shouldn't be on there, you can appeal against that sole condition, and you'll also have to submit all this information against why you think that condition isn't acceptable. Appeals are a very, very slow process, and you want to avoid them at all costs.